You guys are the, yeah, well, it's a closed system. Hey everybody, thanks for coming to New Voices in Nonfiction. The purpose of the New Voices in Nonfiction, the New Voices series, is basically for people who've just published their first book to come here and talk to students. And there's always kind of the shortest distance between our students and people whose first book is coming out. And that's, I think, what makes it my favorite event. It's the most intimate. And I think it's the event in which the students can sort of see themselves in somebody else's shoes in 10 or 15 years, especially if you write a book as substantial as this one, which is the first book. This is Accidental Gods on Men Unwittingly Turned Divine by Della Subin, who was in the very first class I taught here at the University of Chicago 16 years ago in Walker. And I remember vividly Della's first piece. It was about her brother, who was a Versace model.
Dolce and Gabbana.
Dolce and Gabbana. Of course, I always get those two confused. Anyway, after a photo shoot, he had gone to meet some friends on the steps of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City, and they had smoked a joint, and he got arrested and thrown in the clink for a weekend while apparently wearing his Dolce and Gabbana outfit, which is like the last place in the world you want to be wearing Italian designer clothes. And so Della had to go down there and bail him out, and it was just a little 2-3 page piece of writing, and it was perfect. I remember saying, you should just send this to the New Yorker. This is the perfect talk of the town piece. Send it to David Remnick and tell him I sent you, because I want to take credit for discovering this young writer. But Della didn't take my advice. Instead, she started working on her second piece, which was much more substantial. It's a long profile about her uncle Seth that is pretty unforgettable. John, who was also in this class, remembers the piece pretty vividly. And I do too. I haven't read it in 16 years, but I remember Seth. He had a trucker hat, a handlebar mustache, and what used to be a heroin habit, now it's a methadone habit. He was the bass player in the Lovin' Spoonful before they got famous. And I think his great contribution to rock and roll history was he was the first guy to get the Beach Boys high. The Beach Boys were practicing, and he came down and said, "You guys want to try some boo?" Which is a slang term I'd never heard before. So anyway, we all know the famous anecdote about Bob Dylan getting the Beatles high, and that led to Rubber Soul. Well, her Uncle Seth had gotten the Beach Boys high, and that led to the album Smile, and the rest was history. It was just a really funny and ultimately kind of sad piece, and it was the perfect profile. And I thought, once again, you should send this to the New Yorker. Tell David Remnick I sent you. You could be the Joseph Mitchell of the Hamptons. I wanted more drug pieces, but Della had other things to do. I remember at the time, your job involved, you were working for Martha Stewart as her personal assistant, and I really wanted a Martha Stewart drug piece. I had this intuition, and it's been borne out, because now she hangs out with Snoop Dogg. They have a cooking show together, so I'm still looking forward to that piece. Anyway, none of my dreams were meant to be. Instead, Della did something much smarter. She went to Harvard for graduate school, where she studied Sanskrit, among many other things, in the divinity school. And after she graduated, she became an editor at Badoon, the magazine of Middle Eastern art and culture. She moved to Egypt. She wrote many pieces, many essays, a book-length essay on the cultural politics of sleep, an essay on the paintings, the unknown paintings of Dr. Jack Kevorkian. She wrote an essay about procrastination as resistance and reclaiming our right to idleness. That's one very near and dear to my heart and any writer's. She wrote about the modernist poetry of Beirut, 13th century tricksters, the 14th century attempt in Egypt to capture the entire universe in a single book. And then, perhaps influenced by her Uncle Seth, she wrote about the Beatles, the Six-Day War, and the Palestinian rock band Subin. And now she's written this book, 10 years in the making, And a lot has been said about this book. It's been reviewed in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the New Yorker, the London Review of Books, and probably somewhere else by the time I finish this introduction. And it's not really just been reviewed, it's been actually like discussed and thought about and talked about, because it's a book of ideas. It's a really serious, deeply researched book, a scholarly, dare I say, book of history, philosophy, and theology. And there's a lot to discuss in it. And but despite all that, not a whole lot has been said about how comical it is. Not funny and not humorous. Like, humor is kind of like the lowest form of comedy. But a book about men, always men for some reason, who have been turned into gods against their will and against their wishes, and who not only resist this, but actively resent it. That's like an inherently comedic situation. And it's the thing that has the same structure as comedy is tragedy. And it's also one of those. It's tragic because in the way that every successful work of nonfiction is ultimately about more than its ostensible subject, this book is really not about religion. It's about colonialism, ultimately. And it's about the West and modernity and the unquestioned assumption of white supremacy and how that's played out over the decades and the centuries in Asia, the Americas, and Africa. It's also that I think one of the many things I've taken from this book is that I'm not really even sure what religion is anymore after I got done reading it. I've kind of come to the conclusion, helped along by this book, that religion itself, the word, is just this like abstract Western construct that people have superimposed upon a really ambiguous and deeply complex relationship with fate and eternity and colonialism. There's a great quote from Forster that Della puts in about halfway through the book on religion, quoting, I think, a passage to India, where Forster says, "No man could say what religion was any more than he could say what was the center of a cloud." So there are a number of case studies in this book about men who've been turned into gods against their will. There's Haile Selassie, also known as Rastafari. There's Prince Philip. There's General Douglas MacArthur, who was worshipped as a god in 4 different countries, right? Japan, Korea, the Philippines, and I think Panama? Papua New Guinea. And then there's Krishnamurti, which is especially near and dear to my heart because my mom is a devotee. But in many ways, in the same way that like this book is about more than its ostensible subject, it's really, in many ways, these men who've been worshipped were sort of irrelevant to the worship itself, and maybe even the worshipers themselves. And maybe that's why these newly anointed gods like so resented being the recipient of this apotheosis, because they weren't really in control of this new religion that had sprung up around them. The god was actually not at all in charge of what was going on. His worshipers were. They were calling the shots in a way, and they were creating the meaning and the mythopoetics and the mythopolitics that accompany them. And I think that irony is sort of what this book grows out of. It's where the book lies, or I should say starts to tell the truth. The truth that it explores is that in some cases these worshippers actually did as much to mitigate or even subvert colonialism through this apotheosis as they were acquiescing to it. And I'm kind of verging on a spoiler alert here, and I've said too much already. So let's let Della Subin tell us all about it. Please join me in welcoming her back.
Thank you, Dan, for that amazing introduction. And you're so right that my next subject has to be Martha's friendship with Snoop. It's quite surreal and a huge pleasure to be back in Chicago after so long. I just wanted to thank Starsha for her amazing organization. I keep saying this was the best organized event I've ever participated in, so thank you. So I tell a lot of creation myths in my book. But in my own self-mythology, Dan Rayburn's nonfiction class was itself an origin point. When I was Dan's student, I actually didn't have any intentions of becoming a writer as a vocation. But it was Dan who was the first person to read my work and say, you should be a writer, or could be, or get this to the New Yorker ASAP. But no one else had ever said that to me before. So Dan is truly to thank or to blame. So Elaine ended her piece with that image from Kafka of a cage going in search of a bird. And her themes of childhood and autocracy have inspired me to read from a part of my book I wouldn't usually read from because it's so eccentric. But I'm heartened to hear that your mother is a fan of Krishnamurti. So it requires a bit of background context. In the mid-19th century, Annie Besant was a housewife with 2 small children, married to a vicar in the Church of England, when she decided that she was an atheist. She left her husband, and in the custody battle that ensued, the British court determined that she was unfit to be a mother because she didn't believe in God. So Besant lost her 2 children and then went on to become a prominent women's rights activist, trade unionist, socialist, and a prolific writer. She remained a committed atheist until she was asked to review a book, The Secret Doctrine, by Madame Blavatsky, which laid out the tenets of theosophy, an occult movement which believes all religions are paths to the same truth and anticipates that the Messiah is going to arrive very soon. Besant converted to theosophy and became one of its leaders alongside Charles Ledbetter, a charismatic, vampiric former priest. They both moved to its headquarters in Adyar in Madras, or what is now Chennai. And so I first heard of Annie Besant because I grew up with this family legend on my mother's side that we were related to her. I don't write about this in my book, but my great-grandmother's birth name was Lily Besant, born in London, and then she was adopted. But we didn't know anything about the circumstances of her birth. So in writing my book, I actually hired a professional genealogist to try to unravel the connection. But it remains mysterious and probably distant. So anyway, this is the story of how Annie Besant, having lost her own children, kidnaps another and raises him as a god. Convinced the Messiah would descend in the American Midwest, in 1906, Charles Ledbetter alighted upon a precocious 11-year-old boy called Hubert Van Hook, who attended the University of Chicago Laboratory School. Young Hubert's parents were enthralled by the idea of their son's chosenness and ignored the hint of scandal that pursued Ledbetter wherever he went. Informed that he was to be the vessel for the Maitreya, the figure whose previous forms included Christ, Krishna, and the Buddha, a mystified little Hubert and his excited mother set out for Madras, where he was to receive the proper training for a Messiah to be. Yet the passage from Chicago to India was long, and by the time Hubert and Mrs. Van Hook arrived, they found that his celestial seat had been taken. On a stretch of beach in Adyar, where the river meets the sea, Ledbetter had watched from the shadows of the palm groves as an Indian boy bathed. The boy possessed the most unusual aura he had ever seen, Ledbetter recalled, quote, without a particle of selfishness in it. The boy was the 8th son of Jiddu Narayana, an impoverished Brahmin who had recently been hired by the Theosophical Society as secretary for the esoteric section. The child was named Jiddu Krishnamurti, or image of Krishna, after the 8th avatar of Vishnu. When his mother died, Krishnamurti continued to follow her ghost around the house as she went about her chores. While his younger brother Nityananda was hailed as the clever extrovert, Krishnamurti was considered dim and vacant, prone to nosebleeds. Yet catching sight of the 11-year-old boy on the shore, the lapsed Anglican priest was God-struck. Scattered across the earth, there existed a committee of ancient, supernormal men, the theosophists contended, deific elders who had survived long beyond ordinary lifespans to pass along their knowledge to future generations. Called the Mahatmas, or great souls, their physical bodies were so frail they were unable to journey long distances, but they could leave their wrinkled shells to travel on the astral plane to meet their pupils. As rulers of a spiritual empire, they lent their personalities to the unseen power structures that controlled modern earthly life. They formed a celestial bureaucracy that in many ways paralleled that of the British colonial administration itself. Among the Mahatmas was Master Kutumi and the Master Morya, whose fragile bodies were said to dwell in Tibet, although Morya had once appeared in the night at the foot of Annie Besant's bed. The Mahatmas were known for sending rather bossy letters, offering unsought-for advice. Often written on rice paper, the letters would fall like raindrops from the ceiling. Over 1,000 pages of them are currently held in the archives of the British Library and have been examined by handwriting experts. In a letter, the Master Kutumi confirmed Leadbetter's enthusiasm for the boy on the beach, writing, quote, "There is a purpose for that family to be here." Annie Besant was away from Adyar at the time of Krishnamurti's discovery, but she was kept informed of it telepathically. Leadbetter arranged to tutor both brothers who didn't speak English, and after a few months found accommodation for them inside the theosophical compound, allegedly to relieve their widowed father of the burdens of their care. Each night, Leadbetter pursued his investigations into the many past lives of this being whom he renamed Alcyone, after the brightest star in the Pleiades. A few months later, the boys met Besant for the first time when she returned to Madras. Soon after, Besant managed to convince Narayana to sign a legal document granting custody of his sons to her, a demand he would have found difficult to refuse, given that he worked as her employee. The boys took to calling Annie mother, and with Leadbetter, the two formed an odd pair of adoptive parents. In the gated, lush compound of the society, as they awaited the descent of the Maitreya, the vehicle, as he was known, settled into a daily regimen of schooling, exercise, and a wholesome diet, in a routine that fused British and Brahmin habits. For the grooming of a god, the strict schedule began at 5 a.m. with ablutions at the well, followed by enforced meditation with Besant. The boys then met Leadbetter for their morning meal at the Octagon bungalow, at which they were served warm milk, which Krishna had little taste for, and prunes, which he liked even less. Leadbetter would ask them what they had dreamed the night before, and related in turn his own version of the adventures with the Mahatmas they had experienced together on the astral plane. Then their schoolwork would commence in English and Sanskrit as their native Telugu faded away. The afternoons included tennis, followed by, quote, a thorough and efficient evening bath, their British tutor recalled. At bedtime, Leadbetter would read Krishna sufficiently terrifying ghost stories to eliminate all fear unbefitting a deity. Then the netted door to his room was bolted from the outside. It was a highly regimented existence, but as Besant would say, quote, occultism is the most orderly thing in the world. The only other child the boys would see was Hubert, who, much to everyone's embarrassment, had arrived with his mother from Hyde Park just at the moment when Krishnamurti appeared as the One. Hubert, or Orion as he was renamed, remained in the compound for 5 years, continuing his studies alongside the Indian brothers. Yet Hubert felt bitter about his demotion and was forbidden to touch any of Krishna's possessions, quote, for fear of infecting them with imperfect magnetism. In his later life, as a straight-laced Chicago lawyer, Hubert refused ever to speak of theosophy again. As months passed, Krishnamurti grew taller, and his face began to change as he settled into the holiness that was his station. He received a new Christ-like haircut, shoulder length and parted in the middle. His nose turned aquiline and his eyebrows dark and heavy. Only his most important attribute reportedly remained unchanged: his vacant, beatific stare, a divine emptiness to be filled. There was something aloof and detached about him. It was as if he were moving through the actions of a dream, a perfect tool of someone else's ideas, playing some other director's script. As his exterior surface became ever more perfect, several observers began to express concern. Sir Edwin Lutyens, the architect who built New Delhi, wrote disapprovingly to his captivated theosophical wife, quote, I do not believe any Christ was ever brought up to be a Christ as a profession. On certain evenings, the entire colony of Adyar, around 50 people, would climb up to a rooftop terrace. Under the glow of the constellations, they would sit cross-legged to listen to Ledbetter and Besant tell the history of their past lives. They learned that their egos had been bound together by love over the millennia. Each person was given a code name purely to keep track of their movements as they changed identity with each new birth. 70,000 years ago, Alcyon, or the ego of Krishnamurti, had taken his first birth on the misty shores of the prehistoric Gobi Sea. Everyone was eager to hear how their lives had intersected with his. The stories were full of intrigue and romance, innumerable marriages, children, scandals, plus invasions, occasional genocides, destroyed cities, and mundane details, such as what time they had lunch circa 30,000 BC. The theosophists would jealously compete as to who featured most heroically. Who were you in the lives? They asked. And a craze caught on to speculate who had been whose husband or grandmother. For her own part, Besant, who went by the name Heracles, had lived 600 existences. She had been born as Alcyon's baby sister in Minoa, then as his father, then his mother at least twice, eventually reappearing as his son in Mexico. Ledbetter frequently appeared as Alcyon's spouse. In Zimbabwe in the 6th life, Persia in the 10th, and even Mississippi in 22,000 BC. As Besant wrote in her preface to the published version of the Lives of Alcyon, quote, the troubles of the present lose their seriousness when seen in the light of immortality. At night, after everyone had retired from the lives, Krishnamurti would lie down in his bed, only to take off again on an astral commute to his lessons with the masters. In the morning, he would dutifully write down what he had learned, and Ledbetter would type out his notes. After several months, the master Kutumi took over correcting the manuscript and showed it to the Lord of the World in Shambhala, who, much to everyone's surprise, suggested, quote, you should make a nice little book of this to introduce Alcyon to the world. As Ledbetter noted, quote, in the occult world we do as we are told. And so the text, titled At the Feet of the Master, was published. When he received finished copies, Krishna sent one to Kutumi by transmitting it under his pillow while he slept. Within a few years, the little book had sold hundreds of thousands of copies in 40 editions and been translated into 27 languages. Letters to the 14-year-old Krishnamurti began to flood in from readers thanking him for transforming their lives with his divine teachings. An organization was formed around the young Messiah, the Order of the Star in the East, and it soon grew to 15,000 members. In late December 1911, Krishna traveled to Benares to initiate several hundred new acolytes into the order. As he handed out certificates in a solemn ceremony, attendees began to surge forward in a wave of passion, weeping as they spontaneously prostrated themselves before him. It was a scene that could only be described as biblical. Ledbetter wrote, quote, "The outpouring of the Holy Ghost at Pentecost." A phosphorescent blue halo appeared a foot above Krishna's head, quote, and then stretched down into a funnel, Ledbetter reported. Through it, quote, a torrent of blue fire tinged with rose began to flow. Annie Besant was exhilarated and deeply moved to see that the Lord was beginning to use her adopted child as his vessel. She wrote in a letter to her ward, "I love you, my own dear Krishna. I have loved you for so many years. How many? I do not know. Since we were leaping animals and guarded our master's hut, perhaps longer still. Perhaps when we were plants, we put out delicate tendrils to each other in the sunshine and the storm. And perhaps when we were minerals, oh, so very long ago, I was a bit of crystal and you a bit of gold in me." In 1913, just before the Earth's factions hurtled into war, the Indian ambassador to the occult empire invited Annie Besant to visit him in Shambhala. The astral diplomat, the Rishi Agastya, urged her to fight for self-rule in India. Quote, "Claim India's place among the nations," he commanded her. Perhaps the same ancient Agastya said to have been born out of a pitcher into which several gods had ejaculated, and who authored some of the hymns in the Rig Veda. Quote, "The end will be a great triumph," the Rishi concluded, as Besant later recalled in an article for the Theosophist magazine. Although Annie, when she converted to theosophy 20 years previously, had sworn off politics, she could not ignore the Rishi's directive. She penned a fiery editorial, Wake Up India, sent off a volley of pamphlets, started a newspaper, The New India, and so began Besant's next incarnation as a major figure in the movement for Indian independence. She joined the Indian National Congress, met with the Viceroy of the Raj to persuade him that India was ready for self-rule, and presented him with detailed schemes for how best this should be achieved. Yet just as her career in Indian politics was beginning, Besant found herself embroiled in her second custody battle, charged with an unlikely crime for a liberationist, that of stealing someone else's child and turning him into a god. Narayana had decided to take her to court for the devastation she had wrought on his own home. Ever since he had signed the document granting custody, Narayana had become alarmed by rumors of Ledbetter's intimacy with his sons, from the frequent baths to the milk drinking and other habits that broke caste, to reports from a servant who had seen them naked in each other's presence. He was horrified by what Ledbetter had christened, quote, the Pentecostal incident, and by the swelling tide of Krishnamurti worship. Besant responded by firing Narayana from his job as esoteric secretary, ordering him to hand over his papers and leave the premises. The case that began at the High Court of Madras on March 20th, 1913, was not only about the fate of a captured boy god, but that of a captured nation. To the side of Narayana rallied the growing network of Hindu fundamentalists who considered Besant to be appropriating and corrupting Hinduism for her own imperialist aims. For Hindu observers, it was impossible to ignore the connections between India's struggle for liberation and a father's struggle to liberate his sons from English predators, rapacious in ways both sacred and profane. While both sides of Narayana versus Besant were invested in the fight for India's self-rule, the trial exposed profound differences of opinion as to how India or any conquered land should reclaim its sovereignty and what independence should look like. While Besant was highly critical of the British government, she did not seek to abolish the empire itself. India ought to be allowed to govern itself, she contended, but still preserve its allegiance to the crown. More radical nationalists, their numbers ever increasing, countered that India must fight for nothing less than complete independence. At the heart of Besant's politics was the strange, romantic view that it was love and not profiteering that held the British Empire together. Bound by the tyranny of love, the empire was above all a family, in a theory that perhaps exposed Besant's history of belonging to especially dysfunctional ones. She wrote, quote, "The genius of the empire is to make every nation that you conquer feel that you bring them into the imperial family, that they and you from that time forward are brothers." Accordingly, Besant discouraged militant rebellion, for family members must not violently attack one another. She held fast to the idealistic notion of a commonwealth, a unity of Occident and Orient under the crown that was theosophical in nature, with Krishnamurti groomed to embody it. The battle that waged for over a year in the courtroom and on the front pages of newspapers across the empire would become infamous in legal history. As plaintiff, Narayana charged that his son had been the victim of, quote, improper and dangerous practices with a known pedophile who deified Krishnamurti and pretended that the barely literate boy had written a scripture. His son's apotheosis was not only a malicious deception, but would be deeply injurious to his future or any chance of living an ordinary life. But the arrow of deification had not simply been fired in one direction, the plaintiff revealed. Narayana himself had long considered Annie Besant or Sri Vasanta to be divine. Quote, "The plaintiff believed the defendant to be superhuman and was completely under her influence and control," the proceedings recorded. Narayana had been induced by Besant's spiritual power to hand over his sons, and it was only when he began to lose faith in her that he sought legal action. In reply to Narayana's pleas for the boy's return, Besant had cruelly reminded her penniless former employee that of his 13 children, only 5 had survived, quote, "an eloquent testimony as to their home surroundings." Narayana testified that when he read her letter, he was left without words. At the trial, Besant conducted her own defense and highlighted the educational opportunities both boys were receiving in her care. She led the courtroom in an esoteric theological discussion of what precisely the nature of Krishna's role was as vehicle, careful to avoid any overt statements regarding his divinity. In his verdict, the justice ruled in favor of Narayana, but an outraged Besant decided to take it to the highest court of appeals in the British Empire. The Lord Chancellor was a friend from her previous life, and in Downing Street her case was followed in an amicable, if bemused, way. In May 1914, the justices ruled that the original verdict had not considered the boy's own wishes, which were to remain with Besant, although the boys themselves had never been permitted to speak. It was a triumph of one version of love over another, a victory for the idea of empire as family. Throughout the proceedings, later published in the volume Mrs. Besant and the Alcyon Case, an unlikely set of witnesses were brought down from the astral plane. It was, the defendant argued, direct messages from the Mahatmas that justified the decision to remove the boys from the profane influence of their father. Quote, "I want you to civilize them," Kutumi had allegedly written to Ledbetter, "to teach them to use spoons and forks, nail brushes and toothbrushes, to sit at ease upon chairs." The transmissions, received as rice paper letters or as ethereal, telepathic commands, were invoked at the trial to sanction the daily routine established for Krishnamurti. By dragging non-earthly Mahatmas into the tense, heated courtroom in Madras, Besant had imbued them with a new dimension of reality, and they helped her eventually win the case. These undying, ethereal figments had become so real that they could be summoned to a British court of law. During World War I, Krishnamurti and Besant were separated for 5 years. While he remained in England, Annie was in India, where she continued to work for her two causes, the arrival of the Messiah and Indian self-rule. For her seditious activities, she was imprisoned in a hill station by the British government. Upon her release, the 70-year-old Besant was elected to the most powerful leadership role in the Indian nationalist movement as president of the Indian National Congress. All the while, Krishnamurti and Nitya floated among the luxurious homes of wealthy theosophist patrons. Krishna's caretakers, believing the body must remain properly groomed and anointed to become the vessel, saw to it that he was always scrubbed and coiffed, dressed in the finest suits from Savile Row, silk ties from Liberty of London, and brogues polished to an otherworldly sheen. With his brother, Krishnamurti enjoyed going to the cinema, perfecting his golf, playing practical jokes, and riding around the countryside on his motorcycle. Yet beneath his styled surface was a growing despondency. The demands of being a would-be messiah were incessant, from astral diplomacy to requests for locks of his hair to bury in order to magnetize farmland. "I shall go bald," he complained. While the theosophists jealously bickered over their proximity to him, the rest of England spurned him for the color of his skin. When the brothers tried to contribute to the war effort by working in a military hospital, they found many of the wounded soldiers refused to be treated by Indian nurses. While Annie had dreamed of her adoptive children studying at Oxford, none of the colleges wanted to admit them, tainted as they were by the scandal of the custody battle. Balliol rejected Krishnamurti on the grounds that it wanted nothing to do with, quote, a brown messiah. Severed from their birth family and with no money of their own, Krishna and his brother knew that if they left the Theosophical Society, they would have nowhere to go and no prospects. In Sir Edwin Lutyens' wife, Lady Emily, Krishna found another mother substitute and a devoted confidant. He began to send her confessional letters, venting his anguish. "I am a freak of nature," he wrote, "and nature enjoys its freak while the freak suffers. What a life, and is it worth it? This striving for what I don't know," he wrote. "There is a rebellion within me, surging quietly but surely." Yet still, sometimes, Krishnamurti felt he had, quote, spiritual moments. and the Mahatmas continued to appear in their astral forms, melting in and out of shrubbery in their white robes. When Kutumi informed him that he needed to develop a larger vocabulary, Krishna and Nitya set about memorizing several lines of Shakespeare each day. What kind of God art thou that suffers more of mortal griefs than do thy worshippers? The bard had written, lines that spoke too clearly to a wartime deity, shivering in his woolens in the bleak English rain. The end. Take your questions from here.
I will go first. I don't want to hog the time. But I wanted to ask you how you balance skepticism with belief while you recount these, because it's such a lyrical history. It's actually written in a way that a lot of history is not. You know what I mean? Like it's written at a literary level, and in order to do that, you have to be an artist, and to be an artist, you kind of have to embrace what could easily be dismissed as, hokum in some level. And I'm just wondering, like, while you write, how did the process of writing it change your views about spiritual belief, and especially like the sort of codification of belief and the way it gets increasingly elaborate, and sometimes it's kind of hard not to grin a little bit while you're describing the bureaucracy of the celestial architecture?
Yeah, that's such a good question. So I was working on this book for 10 years, and at every single turn or every single sentence I wrote, I was trying to create a suspension of disbelief. I'm never asking whether people really believed in these accidental gods or not. And a number of reviews of the book have actually kind of misunderstood this. So I'm looking at all these different stories of whether they're military officers, prime ministers, politicians, economists who've been hailed as gods unwittingly or accidentally. But I never have a sentence where I say these people believed that or those people believed this. And to me that was really important, because I don't think you can ever really know what someone else believes. There's this review of the book in the FT that said that that's a cop-out. And to me, trying to really interrogate belief, it's like, it's the same kind of spirit as burning people at the stake for heresy, or dropping someone in water to see if they sink or swim to determine whether they're a witch. So it was very important to me that I never comment on anyone's belief. And for my own part, I guess I just let myself get really caught up in these stories, kind of to be moved by just the way people make meanings out of things. It's almost, a lot of these stories, it's almost like birds building nests, grabbing whatever's at hand and weaving it together to create narratives that, point to some transcendence. And so, I hope that comes through in the book. At certain turns, my editor would say things like, we kind of need to bring this down from the mythic plane a little bit. Wait, what's actually going on here? Who really believes what? And I tried to resist that.
That was such a great piece, especially to read here. And one thing, hearing the passage that you read today made me think about was the way it struck me how much this is really a story of Annie Besant, as much if not more than it is about Krishnamurti. And in fact, it's and the book as a whole seems to be concerned in many ways with priesthood as much or more than it is about divinity. and these different forms of priesthood that emerge and constructed divinity around themselves. There are very many different forms of priesthood, that kind of celestial bureaucracy, some are kind of indigenous or insurgent priesthoods, others are like priesthoods that are hegemonic or part of a kind of political or other kind of power structure. And so just kind of, I'm wondering if you might talk to us aloud a little bit about like the role of priesthood in your thinking about the book, and how the kind of gods might actually be a negative space around which these priesthoods are.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And that really gets at the question of like, okay, why accidental gods, like, why not just people who were turned into gods even if they wanted to and wanted to be. And for me, kind of looking at accident, forces of chance, coincidence, it kind of was a way for me to really look at the myth makers, rather than the kind of charismatic figures themselves. And you could definitely call them priests. I tend to think of them as the myth makers. But yeah, in the story of Annie Besant, I guess, yeah, I was really drawn to her story because it's like she's such a liminal. There's something so ambivalent about her, It's like incredibly egregious what she does with taking Krishnamurti away from her father, but then you kind of get drawn into, just like in the letter that I quote from, it's like so moving, this kind of love that she feels for him. And so I guess what I was getting at was just, looking at the narratives that people tell, about what the sacred means to them, in their ordinary lives. And it's often these deifications emerge at moments of loss. So it's times of political upheaval or nationalist uprisings or colonial invasions. And so, so I'm looking at, what narratives people construct, and these narratives are very often created by priestly caste. I think you also see that. I have a whole section of my book about myths of white explorers who are hailed as gods, allegedly by the peoples of the New World. So that's Christopher Columbus, Hernan Cortez, Francisco Pizarro, Francis Drake, and these are, really foundational myths of the Americas. And I look at how these stories get told and retold by sailors and, foremost by priests, but the sailors and explorers kind of come to function as priests in a way, and writing these myths. And the myths so kind of deeply shape America right up to the present day, in the archives of white supremacist thought. That's kind of spiraling answer to your question, but I also apparently have a rabbi in my family history, so maybe it comes from that.
Thanks very much. Can you say a little bit about the research for that particular section that you read, and how that came together, and where you went, and what you read?
Yeah, so in general, most of my research happened at the Bodleian Library in Oxford. Just, reading like everything from, sailors' diaries, missionary reports. The Theosophists wrote an incredible number of texts. There's just an immense archive around Krishnamurti. And then I also, Most of my book is concerned with stories that are already written, why we have this incredible array of tales of people who've been turned into gods unwittingly. But there's actually one chapter which I also thought of reading tonight because it concerns another deified UChicago alum, where I actually go on a road trip with a living god, someone who was hailed as a god once. So that was really my only chapter where I inserted myself into my research. But
is that the Nathaniel Tarn?
yeah, that's Nathaniel Tarn. It's quite funny because so it's actually, there's this professor at Chicago who's kind of famous professor of anthropology, Robert Redfield, and his son Jamie taught me Greek when I was an undergraduate here. And Redfield had 2 doctoral students, and both of them ended up worshipped in different ways while they were sent on their field work. So I don't know why he must be some other, priest of an even higher order. But yeah, so Nathaniel Tarn, who is now in his 90s, who is a wonderful poet and anthropologist, was sent to this village in Guatemala to do his field work. And he ended up kind of getting caught up in this swirl of myths around this deity called the Mom and his prophet, Francisco Sohuel. And he realized his deification ended up lasting for 20 years. And so in my conversations with him, I was really most interested in what does being mistaken for a god feel like? Like, what does that do for you, for your life? Like, Nathaniel, he's kind of like all of us in that he has, good days and depressed days. And, so I kind of want to know, how does, your godhood, does it kind of, electrify this contradiction that we all feel between, wanting to end it all or wanting to live forever? And he's quite funny about it. He's quite kind of curmudgeonly in his fashion. But so he's one of the alums, and the other is this student called Robert Pearson, who was doing field work in Balochistan, which is now in Pakistan, and he died of malaria, and a tomb shrine arose over his remains where people would come and kind of, perform kind of cure. His shrine was kind of had there was the idea that it was able to, perform cures and bring about fertility and things like that. So he's the other one. And then there's Hubert. Poor Hubert.
What inspired you to do this book? I mean, was it from divinity school? And how did you such a big project, how did you get started and to take off on it?
Yeah, so it's funny. So I had just left Harvard Divinity School, and everything I studied was kind of the ancient world. I did study ancient Christian ideas of divine doubles, which I had a great professor, Charles Stang, who I did an event with, who writes about these kind of ancient Christian ideas that we all possess a divine counterpart or twin out there who we might one day encounter. And then I took this job at Badoon, and I ended up in Cairo just as the uprisings of the Arab Spring began. And so I was thrust into the modern world. And I was thinking a lot about what moves people to act politically. Why do people risk their lives for ideas? And I was thinking a lot about kind of charismatic autocrats. And one day I just had this weird epiphany, well, what happens if you have too much charismatic authority? You might find yourself turned into a god against your own will or your best intentions or your political beliefs. And I immediately thought of Haile Selassie and the Rastafarians. And I became obsessed with this idea that a person on one side of the earth could become a god on the other side of the earth without even knowing about it or agreeing to it. And so I started searching for other examples of it. And it turned into this really obsessive quest. Like, I would say obsession is what really sustained it. I ended up finding, I have an index at the back of my book, and I found about 88 figures, and I'm still finding new ones, even with the book already out. So yeah, but that, each figure kind of took me down a different labyrinth of history and, the concept of religion itself, as Dan evoked in his introduction, and the concept of race. And
Thanks, everybody.
thank you so much.